Naukane, likely of chiefly descent, otherwise known as Ali'i in Hawaii, was born in 1779, most likely on the Big Island. As a 12-year-old kid, he saw Captain Cook be killed. As an adult, he traveled to the Pacific Northwest and was the first Hawaiian to travel across the Pacific Northwest to the East Coast. He passed on February 2, 1850, at Fort Vancouver. Naukane is possibly the same person as Naukana, the son of High Chief Kamanava, the King Kamehameha's uncle and trusted advisor. Kamanava is one of the twins featured on the Hawaiian coat of arms. The earliest report we have of Naukane's life is when he was 12 years old on the Big Island of Hawaii, and he witnessed the death of Captain James Cook at Kealakekua Bay in 1779. In 1811, the Tonkin, a 290-ton merchant ship belonging to the American Pacific Fur Company and captained by Jonathan Thorne, stopped on Oahu and recruited 24 Hawaiians to work as laborers in the Pacific Northwest. They could have taken on many more, as there were plenty of Hawaiians eager to travel beyond Hawaii. The Hawaiian Kanakas were recruited for 3 years of service, half in the fur venture and the other half as laborers on Tonkin. At the end of the service, they were to be given $100 worth of merchandise. The Tonkin was owned by fur baron John Astor, and it was on its way to establish the first American trading post on the Columbia River. It was an established practice for European explorers in the Pacific to pick up Kanakas to work on ships, at various plantations, etc. King Kamehameha appointed Naukane to join the group to look after the interests of the Hawaiian laborers. On the voyage to Fort Astoria on the Columbia River, Naukane was given the name John Cox because he resembled a shipmate on the Tonkin. The Tonkin left Honolulu on March 1st of 1811 and reached the mouth of the Columbia 3 weeks later on the 22nd. They had a pleasant passing until the 16th when a south by southwest gale hit and they were forced to flee with a double-reefed foresail. They still made such great speed that the captain decided to lay to for a couple of nights and cautiously drift in. On the morning of the 22nd, they sighted land when they were about 3 miles out and they began to see breaking surf, indicating that they were at the dangerous bar to the entrance of the Columbia. Captain Jonathan Thorne had already shown himself to be rash and to make poor decisions that showed little regard for the lives of his own crew. With high winds and large breaking surf, he ordered a small boat to be lowered and 5 men put in her with some meager supplies and a bedsheet for a sail. They were instructed to sound the channel and were never heard from again. The weather continued to blow and they stood off and on the bar for the next 2 days until, on the 24th, the weather cleared enough for them to approach closer to the river mouth. They could still not see a way over the bar and anchored at Cape Disappointment. The second mate was sent to sound the passage, but found the breaking waves to be too big and returned to the ship by midday. At this point, a calm westerly wind came up that allowed them to raise anchor and approach the river mouth again. The pinnace was dispatched with a couple Hawaiians on board to sound the entrance, with the Tonkin following. As they crossed the bar, the pinnace was sucked out by the river and lost to sight behind them. The sun was setting by this time, and it was a low ebb tide that caused the Tonkin to strike the bottom 6 to 7 times with force. Several big waves broke over the ship and threatened to submerge her. Finally, they coasted into deeper waters, but at this time the wind died down and they had to drop anchor. The ebb tide was so strong that it broke one of their anchor lines and was all they could do to keep the ship straight to the tide. When the tide finally turned around midnight, they rode the flood and a light wind into Baker's Bay, which had a good anchorage. They awoke the next morning on the 25th to high winds and rough waters. The captain and some men went ashore to look for the 2 missing crew. After meeting with some of the natives and searching along the riverbanks, they found Stephen Weeks, the armorer, stark naked. After being clothed and fed, he provided the following account. After you had passed our boat, the breakers caused by the meeting of the wind roll and the ebb tide became a great deal heavier than when we entered the river with the flood. The boat, for want of a rudder, became very hard to manage, and we let her drift at the mercy of the tide, till after having escaped several surges, one struck us midship and capsized us. I lost sight of Mr. Aiken and John Coles, but the 2 islanders were close by me. I saw them stripping off their clothes, and I followed their example, and seeing the pinnace within my reach, keel upward, I seized it. The 2 natives came to my assistance. We righted her, and by sudden jerks threw out so much of the water that she would hold a man. One of the natives jumped in, and bailing with his 2 hands, succeeded in a short time in emptying her. The other native found the oars, and about dark we were all 3 embarked. The tide now having carried us outside the breakers, I endeavored to persuade my companions in misfortune to row, but they were so benumbed with cold that they absolutely refused. I well knew that without clothing and exposed to the rigor of the air, I must keep in constant exercise. Seeing besides that the night was advancing, and having no resource but the little strength left me, I set to work sculling and pushed off the bar, but so as not to be carried out too far to sea. About midnight, one of my companions died. The other threw himself on the body of his comrade, and I could not persuade him to abandon it. Daylight appeared at last, and being near the shore, I headed in for it, and arrived, thank God, safe and sound, through the breakers, on a sandy beach. I helped the islander, who yet gave some signs of life, to get out of the boat, and we both took to the woods. But seeing that he was not able to follow me, I left him to his bad fortune, and pursuing a beaten path that I perceived, I found myself, to my great astonishment, in the course of a few hours near the vessel. They spent the rest of the day looking for the Hawaiian that Weeks had left at the entrance of the forest, but were not able to find him. The next morning the search party went out again and found the Kanaka under some rocks, half dead with cold and fatigue, his legs swollen and feet bleeding. They clothed him and made a warming fire and brought him back on board to recover, which he did. Towards evening, a group of the Kanakas went ashore to handle the last rites of their deceased compatriot. The Kanakas were reported to have dug a pit for the body, which was placed alongside of the pit. They placed a biscuit under one of the arms, a piece of pork under the other, and tobacco between the chin and also the groin area. The body was then lowered into the grave and covered with sand and stones. The Kanakas then knelt in rows on either side of the grave, with their faces to the east except for one who officiated like a priest. This Kanaka filled his hat up with ocean water and sprinkled it over the others, reciting a kind of prayer which they responded to. When the prayer was over, they arose and returned to the ship, looking neither to the left or to the right as they walked. Their party then spent the next few months establishing and building Fort Astoria. The Kanaka were given the duty of caring for the pigs in the gardens. In July, British-Canadian mapmaker and surveyor David Thompson, employed by the Canada-based Northwest Company, arrived at the fort and rested for a week. Thompson was headed inland to Spokane House. He exchanged one of his men who knew the territory and natives well for Naukane, as he needed somebody who could paddle and swim. Naukane went with Thompson to Spokane House. Spokane House was a fur trading post founded in 1810 by the British-Canadian Northwest Company, located on a peninsula where the Spokane River and Little Spokane River meet. When established, the Northwest Company's farthest outpost in the Columbia River region was the first ever non-Indigenous settlement in the Pacific Northwest, south of the present-day 49-degree latitude border. An American rival of the NWC, the Pacific Fur Company, opened a station adjacent to Spokane House called Fort Spokane. The War of 1812 and ongoing supply issues caused the collapse of the PFC, with its posts now under the control of the NWC. The original Spokane House was abandoned in favor of Fort Spokane, though the latter location was still called Spokane House. The second Spokane House saw use as a major post in the interior Oregon country until the NWC was absorbed by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. During a general tour of the Pacific Northwest, Spokane House was abandoned by George Simpson in 1825 in favor of a new post that became Fort Colville. The site of Spokane House is in Spokane County in the U.S. state of Washington, just northwest of the city of Spokane. Naukane continued on with Thompson's party to Fort William near Lake Superior, arriving in July of 1812. There they learned that Great Britain and the U.S. had begun the War of 1812. To aid in the war against the Americans, the Northwest Company decided to forcibly seize Fort Astoria. A party, which included Naukane, due to his experience crossing the treacherous Columbia River bar, was to be sent to England with the mission to outfit a ship and return to Astoria. Naukane was able to continue by water to Quebec and via the Isaac Todd made his way to England, arriving there later in 1812. After a brief sojourn in England, during which he was nearly shanghaied in Portsmouth, Naukane returned to Astoria in 1813 aboard the HMS Raccoon. However, by that time, the peaceful surrender and transfer of Fort Astoria from the Pacific Fur Company to the Northwest Company had been negotiated, and the fort, now under British control, was renamed Fort George. Naukane remained at Fort George until 1814, when he returned to Hawaii. Naukane returned to Hawaii in 1815 and joined the court of Prince Iolani Liholiho, who succeeded Kamehameha I in 1819 and became King Kamehameha II. In 1823, Kamehameha II and other high-ranking members of the court, including Naukane, traveled to England, arriving there in May of 1824. For nearly a month, the court was received in London and toured the city, but by late June, many members, including the king, had contracted measles. On July 8, the queen's consort, Kamamalu, died. Days later, on July 14th, Kamehameha II died. The bodies were returned to Hawaii for burial, but Naukane and the others in the traveling party who did not contract measles were regarded with suspicion. Concerns about misspent funds from the king's treasury also increased tensions, and it is speculated that Naukane returned to his life in the North American fur trade and his identity as John Cox to escape this scrutiny. In 1821, Naukane's former employer, the Northwest Company, merged with the Hudson's Bay Company. Thus, when Naukane resumed his career in the fur trade, it was as an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. From 1824 until 1842, Naukane worked as a middleman at Fort George and Fort Vancouver. The term middleman was a boating term that was also used in a broader sense to describe general laborers at fur trade posts. During this time, Naukane may have served in boats traveling the Columbia River and other regional waterways, but he also likely performed other types of manual labor. In October of 1825, Naukane was implicated in a possible theft of beaver skins and blankets aboard the ship William and Anne at Fort George, said to have been perpetrated by some of the fort's Hawaiian employees. Naukane was accused of giving blankets to his wife, probably indigenous woman he had married since his return to the Northwest. Some of the accused admitted they had taken blankets for the native women they were living with or married to, but Naukane maintained his innocence. A unique aspect of Naukane's service in the fur trade is his work at Fort Vancouver's swineherd. He is recorded in this position in the years 1826 to 1835 and 1842 to 1843, concurrently with being recorded as a middleman. Fort Vancouver's chief actor, Dr. John McLaughlin, had received orders from his superiors to establish a farm that could provide provisions to the HBC's network of forts in the region, as well as enough beef and pork for ships leaving the fort to return to England. McLaughlin was dedicated to the creation of a highly productive and efficient farm surrounding the post. Early on, establishing a herd of pigs at the fort was difficult. Many were killed as a result of eating poisonous weeds. In 1836, McLaughlin wrote to the company's directors in London, "There is a weed in our plains which poisons a great number of our pigs, but it will get extirpated." By 1844, the farm was a success. The herd that Naukane was responsible for included 727 pigs. Naukane was not the only Hawaiian who was in charge of this important task at Fort Vancouver. He was joined by fellow Hawaiians Oru Hawaii, recorded as a pig herd from 1832 to 1937, and Kauai, recorded as a pig herd from 1833 to 1845. Naukane, Oru Hawaii, and Kauai grazed the fort's pigs on the plain between the fort and the Columbia River, an area that became known as Cox's Plain, due to Naukane being known locally as John Cox. In his later years, Naukane was remembered by Fort Vancouver's residents and visitors as a great storyteller who was especially fond of recounting his memories of Captain Cook's death. In 1845, he was joined at Fort Vancouver by his younger relative, perhaps a son or nephew, William Naukane, who went on to have a long career at the HBC's posts in Canada and San Juan Island. In 1847, traveling artist Paul Kane visited Fort Vancouver and painted Naukane. This portrait is now in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum. On February 2, 1850, Naukane, or John Cox, died at Fort Vancouver at the approximate age of 83. Thomas Lowe, a clerk at the fort, wrote in his journal the next day, "Old Cox, a Sandwich Islander, who has been a long time in this country in the company's employ, died here yesterday afternoon. He was in England and Canada and was about 12 years old when Captain Cook was killed at Owaihi.